My name's Dean. I own Cadence Cycle, and today we're just going to talk a little bit about one of the most common things that happens to bicycle owners, which is flat tires. I was going to start off with, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Amy with the City of Whitehorse
Okay.
Bike Week. I'm just here to ask questions on your behalf.
And thanks for having a bike week even in these sort of weird times. So first of all, I just wanted to talk a bit about what you should have with you if you're riding your bike, and so that you're prepared for a flat. So most things are fairly straightforward. A spare tube is a good thing to carry. These are patches. You can patch a tube wherever you are. You don't need to carry a spare tube, but patching takes longer and is ultimately maybe a little less reliable than just putting a new tube in. So typically I would carry a spare tube with me, and if I want to patch my tubes later to reuse them, I just do it at home. This kind of tube is the old style. Very good, like it's a chemical bond. It's basically the same as a new tube once it's repaired. These ones are pre-glued. They're pretty fast. You can stick them on in the field and you're done pretty quick. Not quite as reliable. The other thing you want to have with you are a set of tire levers. They usually come in 2s or 3s. You don't usually need 3 to take a tire off, but sometimes you will, and sometimes you'll break one. So that's why you usually get them in sets of 3s. The other thing you need to have is some means of putting air back into the deflated tube. So this is a CO2 cartridge. That's a one-use deal. The head, of course, is reusable, but the cylinder itself isn't. You would carry that if you're in a hurry. And it's good for road bikes because you can really get to operating pressure pretty fast, which is hard to do on a hand pump. 100 psi is tough to achieve. And then this is kind of the typical hand pump. This will do either of the 2 common valves in use, which are Presta or Schrader. Basically, you want some sort of combination of this stuff. A new tube or a way to repair a tube, some way to get the tire off of the rim, and then some way to reinflate it.
You might be about to get to this, but how do people know what size tube? How can they find that information?
It's going to be based on your tire. So why don't we look over to the bike here. So if you look on this tire, you'll see written on it size. This is 2.4 by 29 inch. The other thing you want to look at is what type of valve does it have. So this is a Presta valve. It's quite skinny. It's metal, exposed metal. That's what this tube is for. It's marked Presta. You will also see what's called an auto valve or a Schrader valve, which if you have a car you're familiar with, it's the one you would normally fill up at a gas station. Usually rubber coated and bigger in diameter. The rim will be drilled for one or the other. They're not, broadly speaking, interchangeable. You should have the correct one. Okay, so you're riding along and something sharp happens. And you hear that air coming out of your tube. So Presta valves, you have to open this little guy here. There's a little knurled knob here. It screws in to close the valve, and this opens the valve. And then to deflate it, you push it in. If you want to inflate it, it has to be open. And you would have no idea how much of a mechanic's day is spent explaining Presta valves. I saw a pie chart once, and it was a funny pie chart. It was about 60% of the day talking to people about Presta valves. So anyway, now this tire is pretty much fully deflated. Now, usually if you're working on this on the road, you're gonna have the bike upside down. We're gonna do it in a stand because that's the way bike mechanics like to do things. And maybe this happened at home and you have a stand, but you would be working upside down. So the first thing you wanna do is take the wheel off. And before you go out anywhere probably, you should be familiar with how to remove the wheel of your bike. Like, this is a good thing to do at home, just so you know how to do it, so you don't have to try and puzzle it out on the road. This bike uses a quick release, which is a very conventional system, been around since really the 1950s. Starting to die out. You may also find your bike has a through axle, which is basically a big bolt that passes through the frame, and in which case may require a tool to remove. If your bike has that, then you also want to make sure you have a multi-tool with you so that you can take out that through axle. Other alternatives might be just a nut and bolt system. And you'll see that on cheap bikes or BMXs. In that case, they're a little harder to remove on the fly because you need some form of decent sized wrench. So those you may not be fixing in the field, and they're maybe not so common anyway. But a lot of really cheap bikes will have that, or BMX. So anyway, remove the wheel, you undo the quick release latch. And you may have to just spin this nut back a little bit. Push. And the wheel comes out. Okay, so we got the wheel off the bike. Now what you need to do is break the bead, which is basically pushing in with your thumbs and pushing the tire towards the center. On some As you get more modern bikes, this is often quite difficult because they're designed to run tubeless, so they're a little harder to get the tires off. This one, it's not too bad. Road bikes, this can also be a little challenging because the tires are just small and tight fitting. So you want to get the bead broken all the way around. That gives you kind of the most room to play with in terms of getting the tire off. Now you may not need tire levers, but I'm going to use them anyway. So what you're going to do is get levers in a couple of spots, you know, usually, I don't know, like 100 millimeters apart, something like that. And then you're going to lever them together like that. And that's going to get the bead off above the rim. And then you push. At this point now you can take this off by hand. Now if you want, you can take the tire all the way off the rim, or you can just take it off one side. I'm just going to take it off one side. And then undo this. There's a little lock ring here that needs to come off. Then you can remove the tube. The next step is you want to, this is hard to do if you're using CO2, but if you have a hand pump, what you want to do is just have a look. You want to inflate the tube and see if you can find the cause of the puncture and where it is. So we're just going to pump this up a little ways. Okay, so there we can see there's a hole there. And you can actually, sometimes it's ringed by a little bit of talcum powder because the inside of the tube is filled with talcum powder just to keep it from sticking to itself. So you'll often see a little bit of an explosion there anyway, but you may or may not. But the reason you want to do this is you want to locate where it is on the tube. So in this case, it's on the exterior surface, which indicates that it's because you ran over something is probably what caused it. But you might also see, for example, two side-by-side slits, like about here on the sidewall. That's called a snake bite. That's typically caused by an impact. That means you hit a curb or a rock or something like that, and the tube has been forced to bend around the rim, and that causes two side-by-side slits. So if you find that, you know it's not a problem with your tire, but you might want to look for rim damage. And that'll usually be a very sudden deflation. The other thing you might see is sometimes a flat on the interior surface of the tube, which indicates probably some failure of the rim tape inside the wheel. And the reason you want to know what caused the flat is because you want to make sure that it doesn't happen again immediately. So this is the rim tape. If you had a flat on the interior of the tube, then chances are this has been disturbed, it's been pushed to one side, or it's failed, because they do fail sometimes. In this case, we know that it was something that punctured the tire from the outside. So what you want to do, one of the things we do in bike shops is when we install a tube, you always put whatever badging is on the tire in line with the valve. And that gives us a point of reference. So when we go looking for a flat, we can look at where the valve stem is on the tire, and then relate that kind of to where the flat is. In this case, we know it's actually quite close. It's almost immediately adjacent. But it does give you a point to go hunting in the tire. And what you want to do is just have a feel around inside the tire, because lots of times something sharp has caused a puncture, but it's still in the tire. It might be lodged in there. So if you put a new tube in there, it's going to flat again immediately, because you still have a thorn or a piece of glass, or wire is very common from tires, from car tires. So that's an important step that often gets overlooked and causes multiple flats. So have a really good feel around. Be careful because there might be something sharp there. And sometimes they're very subtle, but that's a big step. Okay, next thing we're going to do, we've inspected the tire, we found out what caused the flat. We're going to put a new tube in it. All right, so we've kind of had a look at our tire, but we can't find anything lodged in it. We found out where the flat is, and now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is putting a new tube in, or if you're going to patch it, going through the patching procedure, which I'm not going to go through because it takes about 20 minutes for this glue to dry. And you really just have to sit there watching glue dry. It's not very good TV. So, take your tube out. You may not have this in a box, you may be carrying it loose or wrapped, or there's a number of ways you can carry it. So the first thing you want to do is put a little bit of air in the tube just to give it some shape. Otherwise it's pretty difficult to install and it's easy to twist it. So I'm just going to grab a pump here. And if you're in the field, you'd be doing this with a hand pump, but it takes a lot longer. So you don't need a lot of air, just enough to give it a little bit of form. Okay. Now in this case, we didn't take the tire all the way off. You could if you wanted to, but it's not really necessary. You want to get your tube, load it in the tire. Like that, and then you want to start reinstalling the bead. So I usually start around the valve. And you start working your way around. And these can be kind of floppy sometimes. It may feel like you need like 6 hands to do this. Well, that's starting to be pretty close. Now, you get to a point somewhere like this where it starts to get difficult to reinstall. I could probably install this by hand, but I'm just going to use the levers just to show people how to do it. So this is your lever hooks onto the rim. Now you want to be very careful that you're not actually, that you're hooking onto the rim rather than having a little bit of tube trapped there. Because if you lever against the tube, you're going to puncture the tube, which is called a pinch. And you want to kind of lever it in small chunks. If you try and grab too much at a time, you're liable to just break your lever. And in some instances, you may want to hold it with one lever and then go get a second one in there, just to keep it under tension. Okay, and there, now you're back, now you're on. Now the thing you want to do next is just inspect that there's no tube lodged under the bead. And in this case, there actually is a tiny bit of tube that I can see under the bead. So you just kind of work the tire back and forth to make sure you haven't trapped the tube anywhere. And have a good look around. On road tires, this is especially critical because the tire is quite small and so is the tube. And it's really easy to lodge it underneath this metal bead that holds the tire in place. And if you do that, it's going to puncture. Often really explosively. It makes a lot of noise. So you just want to have a look around. The thing you want to do is just push the valve up, make sure that it's not, sometimes the valve, around the valve core, there's a thicker bit of rubber, and that can be lodged under the bead as well. Again, much more common in road tires, but you want to make sure that you can freely move the valve core up and down. At this point, you're pretty much ready for inflation. You may want to put this guy back on, this ring, just to keep the rim, or the valve from being pushed back up. And now we're going to inflate the tire. It's useful to know what pressure your tires should be inflated to. Mountain bikes, it's usually typically between 25 and 30 psi, which is roughly 2 bar, if you're using bar. Road bikes, it's much higher, more in the 100 psi range. On all tires, the pressure range will be printed on the tire. Usually road tires, you're going to run pretty close to the maximum. Mountain bike tires, usually somewhere in the middle, depending on how you're using it. You hear that snap there, that's the tire being forced onto the bead. Don't be alarmed, that's normal. So I just get this up to about 30. If you're doing this with a small hand pump, this will take quite a bit longer. And then you just close off press the valve and put the cap on. Okay, so next thing you want to do is reinstall your wheel. So you're going to pull down the derailleur cage, and then get the chain onto the cog that you took it off of, in which case is the smallest cog. And then you're going to pay a bit of attention to your brake rotor, and then get it up onto into the drop house. And you're going to tighten up this little guy, and tighten your quick release. Quick releases need to be tight. You should be able to see a mark on your hand from doing up the quick release. If you don't, you haven't really done it up tight enough, and we frequently see them not properly installed. And then after that, give the wheel a spin. Make sure your brakes aren't rubbing, because sometimes they will after you reinstall a wheel. There may not be much you're going to do about that in the field, but something to be aware it can happen. And then it's done. It's ready to ride at this point. Okay. So, and that's that. The bike is done. It's ready to be ridden now.
Awesome.
There you
Thanks, Dean.
go. You're welcome.
Bike Week is taking place in Whitehorse from June 1st to 5th. If you want to go to whitehorse.ca/Bike Week, we have a bunch of safe, physically distant activities and initiatives. You can participate in there.